Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Valentin Consulting's YouTube channel and our YouTube channel guest speaker series. My name is Dr. Daisy Valentin with Valentin Consulting. We are so excited to be here with Cristina Archila. And not only that, we're just excited that you're here to bring some great information. At Valentin Consulting, we're all about community. We're here to bring different partners within the community. Not only do we do accounting, finance, bookkeeping, and payroll, but we also help those in the community to expand. We want you to please welcome Cristina. I am so happy for you to be here. She is the vice chair of the board of directors of Domestic Abuse Project. Is that correct?
Yes,
Cristina.
ma'am. Yes.
I'm so excited. We're so happy to have you here. Tell us a little bit about you and your role, and tell us a little more. What do you do?
Yeah, so I'm the vice chair on the board of directors of DAP, as well as serving as the advancement committee chair for them. So I'm a volunteer on behalf of the organization. I've been on the DAP board for almost 2 years now, focusing on outreach and fundraising on behalf of the organization and promoting the amazing work that they do. I first got connected to the org a few years ago. I was a child witness to domestic violence as a youth. And then in the last couple of years, I experienced an abusive situation myself. So a friend had reached out and said, hey, you might want to get connected with this organization. I learned about the amazing work that they were doing with victim survivors, child witnesses, as well as the rehabilitation of those who use harm. And their mission just deeply resonated with me. And so now here I am.
Awesome. That is so amazing. It takes a village, right? It takes a village for us to see where we can get these community resources. And I know that, it's really hard to see that you've been through something. Most of us have. I've been through something myself, as a young child, but, some of them are a little bit more than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how do we get our community to effectively raise awareness about this, raise awareness about gender biased violence? What's the impact on those survivors? Like, what do we do?
Yeah. So honestly, it starts with what we're doing today and having open conversations, right? Gender-based violence is an unfortunate normal in our communities. And the best way to combat that is just to start talking about it, So like when I talk about my own personal experiences, just as you shared with me, it's not uncommon for women to just start sharing their stories with me. When people hear they're not alone in their experience, it empowers them to speak up and move past it. Unfortunately, the latest femicide report put out by the shows that every 10 minutes, a woman is murdered by her intimate partner or a trusted family member, making the most dangerous place for a woman right now her own home. And it's something that we hear about globally, but it's also something that impacts us here, like on a national level. 1 in 3 women will experience violence at the hands of her partner here in the US. And every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted, 90% of which are unfortunately women. And 15% of those cases are by married spouses. And then there's an unfortunate stat that anywhere from 3 million children to 10 million children will witness domestic violence each year. And being a witness alone has a detrimental impact on like growth and development of children. So this is a level of violence that's normal in our culture, but the unfortunate part is people are stigmatized for it. So they're not having these conversations like we're having today. We hear a lot of like, well, why didn't she walk away? And without realizing the complicated nuances as to why victim survivors stay in relationships in the first place. And, as, either a child witness or somebody who's been through it, it's a really, frustrating response. And it's important that we know that it's no one's fault that they're being abused. People are manipulated emotionally, financially, physically, and there's so much at play here. And so when I think about like community awareness, I think about when I was in this situation, it was really embarrassing for me to come forward and tell my loved ones and my community my story. But like I started to because I was operating at this level of fear and I knew that I needed support and help. And the story I want to share with you is one of the most loving responses that I actually received from a dear friend of mine, which was he apologized to me. He said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry that I didn't create a space in which you felt safe enough to, come to me and tell me what was happening. I'm sorry that you felt alone. And I need you to know that you're not alone. and that you didn't deserve what happened to you. And that story is important to me because, there's a lot of guilt and shame. Like, people think it's their own fault. And I carry that with me. And I remind myself, like, I'm not alone. I don't need to feel guilt or shame. I'm surrounded by a community who loves me and values me. And, abuse is successful because of isolation. So if we want to raise awareness, we need to build a community in which, victim survivors can come forward and tell their stories, right? Where they are loved and valued. Otherwise, like, we have to ask ourselves, where does that leave victim survivors? And what does that say about the community we're fostering, right? I just told you all these stats.
Mm-hmm.
That means that, like, with that many people being impacted, every single one of us knows someone in our lives who's been impacted by this level of violence. And it's up to us as the community to, foster a loving environment in which victim survivors can come forward.
And now that you say that, when you talk about the loving environment, is that also educating them? Because we do have to play a role, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what is the role in educating them, like not to just prevent gender-based violence, or how can communities integrate it into their daily practices? Like, how can they be able to notice? I know sometimes we can bring someone into a loving environment and try to help them as much as we can, and this is from my experience.
Yeah.
But it's up to the victim to want to change or leave, because we can do so much. But I call it a way where when you cry wolf too many times, then people don't listen, which it's sad, but we don't want that to happen. So how do we educate people to not see it that way, to not see it, oh, I'm crying wolf, and now I don't want to help this person because it's the same thing every time I talk to them.
Yeah, so there's two different components to this, right? There's like educating the general public about gender-based violence, and then there's also like how do we as the community educate ourselves, right? So there's two different components to this. So first, when we talk about like educating the general public, it's incredibly important in how we address this, and we can do this in a myriad of ways, right? Like, so for example, I worked in St. Paul Public Schools for about 10 years. And I worked with kindergartners. And one thing that they did was counselors would come in, right? And they would have conversations that were developmentally appropriate, teaching kindergartners the concept of consent, right? Using the example of like, can I give you a hug? And if somebody says no, respecting those boundaries, right? So we can educate the public from a young age on what consent looks like developmentally, right? And as kids get older and youth get older, we can implement, programs through toxic relationships. When I worked for Boulder Options, it's a youth mentoring organization in Minneapolis. There's this amazing curriculum called Love is Respect that I brought to the program. And it's to teach middle schoolers and high schoolers those like navigating toxic and unhealthy relationships. And should they be in that situation, who is a trusted adult in their life they can come forward to say, I've been experiencing dating violence. Also, there's organizations locally like Cornerstone Advocacy, right? They do workshops for youth. And so I bring up that education component piece because I think like if we want this cultural shift, like from a young age, we need to be teaching, what does consent look like? What does it look like or feel like to be in a healthy relationship? Right. And so when we talk about education, there's that piece. There's also this other piece where we're hearing like, the idea of somebody is crying wolf. And I think it's really hard, right, when we are friends or a family member of a loved one, right, who's experiencing this, because it's hard to receive that information, right? Like you're seeing it. And I would advise you, if you have the capacity, right, because you have your own mental health that you have to take care of, if you have the capacity to not abandon this person, because by being in their community and loving them non-judgmentally, you could be their lifeline that they finally come forward to and say, I'm ready to take the next step. But a lot of times, folks are experiencing, what's called like a trauma bond. So it's this constant, it's like an emotional addiction in which there's this constant push-pull of like, adrenaline and cortisol and dopamine and serotonin. So it's not as simple as just, walking away. And so it's kind of a hard thing to answer, right? Because we have this like piece
and
of like,
it's hard to walk away, because you got to think about that person too that's being victimized. Do they have children? Do they have, like, it's not like it's different when it's one person, but if that person has children, whether it's a male or female, right, that's being abused, that's where the situation comes, because we don't, we want to love on them, and they, like you said, they can't just get up and go, so they feel that they're trapped in
They,
that space
yep. And a lot of times,
because of their children.
yeah, a lot of times they are trapped. Like financial, like abuse is very common in these situations. So it's not as easy as just being like, I'm going to walk away, because shelters are at capacity, right? Like going to a DV shelter may not be an option for you.
Mm-hmm.
It also may not be an option for you based on like your gender. A lot of folks who are experiencing violence are women, but if you are a man experiencing violence, a lot of DV shelters are centered around women and children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like there are a lot of components at play. I did want to mention really quickly before we move on from education about the idea of re-educating those who've used harm,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what makes DAP so unique and special, is that they have services for not only victim survivors and child witnesses, but they use evidence-based strategies for violence and harm reduction by working with those who've actually used harm. And they have a pretty high success rate from those who've completed services, within 90% after completing their 22-week psychotherapy program. They have not gone on to re-enter the criminal justice system. And when they do a 5-year check-in, right, that number is at 70% of those who've used harm have not reoffended with DV convictions. And I just think that, so when it comes to education, there's this other component that we don't typically talk about, which is how do we get those to stop using harm? How do we re-educate and rehabilitate those who use harm?
So that's great. Brings me to my next question here, because we want to educate the community, right? So how can we, as a community, right? How can communities create spaces for these survivors? Because it is hard, like, to tell your stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to tell your stories, and like you mentioned, there was fear, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's fear, support without judgment, without retaliation. What we
Mm-hmm.
just talked about, that crying wolf, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I describe it like that because I remember Red Riding Hood. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, I use it that way, the Red Riding Hood aspect. But how do we get these communities? And I really love the fact that DAP is here. All these other organizations are here too. That many people that we've seen, even more since COVID, have been experiencing domestic violence, because they were in situations, because they had nowhere to go, right? Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
because it was like everything was locked down, right? And you were stuck in that space with that person. So how did the community, help people to allow them to feel safe? Like, I guess that's the word, feel safe to share their stories without having judgment or retaliation or things like that.
Well, if you have trusted people in your life, we kind of address that, like where I had this person, right, who is like, I'm sorry. And that friend has done a lot for me. I had another friend that I hadn't mentioned who she befriended me intentionally because she started noticing like things were off about me. And she was like, oh, like she had been in an abusive situation for like 7 years. And she watched me and me change after I started like dating somebody. Right. And so she had stepped in. And so if you have the skills and you're noticing, that's the first thing, right? Stepping in when you're seeing somebody like in your immediate community. Otherwise, if you're like, what can I do to help, my friend? I highly suggest, connecting them with some kind of confidential peer support group, because this is a place in which you can share your story, non-judgmentally, right? Nobody in your support group is going to ask you, why didn't you leave? Right. Or if it's like you're a victim of sexual violence, nobody's going to ask you, what were you wearing? Right. These are going to be a group of shared experiences. So I actually gained the courage to first speak out about my home life when I was a teenager, because I was in a peer support group called Alateen, which is a support group for children who are the children who are the children of addicts, right? So, and so that was the first time I was able to like talk about the violence that I was seeing, or the anger that I had, or, the fear that I was experiencing. And I was just allowed to be, right, authentically and judgment free. And that's a really important part of healing, is to be in community. And so what I will say, that I'm proud to say, like with organizations that do DV work, especially here in the Twin Cities, is a lot of them are survivor driven and survivor led. And I think that's a really important piece, that that you're working with an organization in which people have personal experience with DV or SV. And if you're curious about it, just ask. Like at DAP, I'm proud to say, like, a majority of the board members have a personal connection to domestic violence, right? And so when you're working with organizations that are survivor driven and survivor led, you can help foster, right, communities within that organization in which victim survivors feel comfortable and, asking for support and help.
And that's where I see a lot of times, because I see that a lot of the people that need the support, they go to the wrong support, right? Instead of going to support like these organizations that, like you mentioned, that have people that have either survivor of these type of things, they go to someone like their churches, right? Their church, or someone that doesn't really know their situation, right? Or never experience a situation like that. So then they'll try to go to that person, and now that person is judging them, not helping them. It's more of a judgment instead of help, because many times they don't see it,
Yeah, and that's a real risk. I went to a conference last year at the U of M called the Safe Assault Family Education Conference, and it was to educate med students on like supporting victims of sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I had heard a speaker talk about a time in which she had gotten a translator, right? And because she did not speak the language, and the victim survivor was telling their story, and they're going back and forth through this translator, and but they actually noticed that the victim survivor, like, her body language wasn't responding in the way that you would expect them to, about like receiving resources and referrals. So that employees sat with that for a couple days and called the translating service back and asked them to come back with a new translator. And unfortunately, that original translator had passed a lot of guilt and shame and told them that, like, this is an embarrassment to your husband, this is an embarrassment to your community. So yes, sometimes when you go to what you assume is a trusted place, right, that can happen. I will say churches are, though, like a great resource, and just asking them. I think the kinds of questions you should be asking are like, who are you working with? Right? Because if the person you're asking doesn't have that resource, you need to find resources outside of that. Like, your church should be connected to, say, DAP, or say, like,
to one of the organizations that help that.
Yeah.
Like, they can't just put anybody into that spot and say, hey, you're going to counsel this person, right, and not have the credentials or the means to know what's going on. They shouldn't be judging a couple or couples based on just what one person said and not the other. You know what I mean? So I've seen that over the years, in my experience. And I'm usually telling some of the people that I know, I'm like, hey, you need to find, these resources. And, I got to meet you, and you were talking to me about that. That's what really led me to that, because, there is a past that I've had, and, I'm lucky I survived that, without support. Right. But many people don't, many people don't survive some of the stuff that they have. They need more support. Sometimes they never get out of it until that person is gone. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so I feel that in our community, not only do we need to be aware, but also I want to kind of like bring this back to, is how can the criminal justice system work effectively for those in the community to support survivors of gender-based violence? Because those people that, do the wrong things to them should be accountable for those things. So what can we tell someone if it's a justifiable, if they know they're going through this? Is it important for them to know how the justice system works?
Yes. And I will be honest, I'm not an expert on the criminal justice system, but I will, give what I know about this, because right now we do have to work within a system that exists today while also pushing for meaningful change, right? So the criminal justice system is the criminal justice system, and it is flawed, right? But there are steps that can be taken to better support survivors and hold perpetrators accountable, right? So for example, there was a domestic violence work group that wrote a report a little over a year ago on the Minneapolis Police Department's response to domestic violence. They tracked over 43,000 domestic violence related calls, and only about 20% of them resulted in a report or arrest, right? And that's a huge gap, right? Only 20% of the calls are there's a response to is
That's
wild.
not a lot.
Yeah. And so, one improvement is prioritizing through documentation, right? Even if the arrest isn't made, having officers do a detailed report can be critical because, you need that report for getting a protective order or like other legal support down the line. The report also highlighted what happens when a person who uses violence leaves right before the officers arrive, right? They're fleeing. And right now, follow-up isn't really a priority. And so it's leaving survivors more vulnerable. But what I can say is that there are policy in place that allow for proactive follow-ups, but what's missing is that accountability piece and making sure that, those happen and understanding what the level of risk is for a victim survivor if that individual is able to avoid being arrested and going through, their own accountability process for the violence they've caused. And then the other issue that when it comes to the criminal justice system is there's this lack of trust with law enforcement, particularly for women of color, because they're often dismissed or not taken seriously when they first report abuse. And so, this whole report, calls out the need for better training. And while many departments, require this implicit biases training and trauma-informed response, we don't really know if it's working because we need officers to do more than just, check a box, but we need them to actively engage with victim survivors and the advocates who work alongside them. And so what's required is not just an increase in knowledge about DV, but really a cultural change about, how we see victims and families struggling with the use of violence and our response to them, especially when they're working with communities of color, indigenous communities, the LGBTQIA community, elders, and folks with disabilities, So I will say with DAP, we actually work within the system every day, particularly through the intervention prevention program, which is primarily court ordered. So the court will, order a person who uses harm to come to our intervention prevention program, and they helping them take accountability and change their behaviors so they don't reoffend, right? So it's an example of how we can use existing structures to not only support survivors, but really break the cycles of abuse. Because, we have a system right now in which we take somebody who's used harm, we lock them away, and then they come back out, right?
Yeah,
and so
but they don't get no help. They don't get no help while they're there.
Right. And so I'm not sitting here saying anything about punishment or response, but I'm saying
it's about support.
It's about supporting
everybody
them.
needs support. Yeah, everybody needs counseling. Everybody needs support, whether they're the victim or the perpetrator, the person that's doing the harm. A lot of people don't think that. Me as a Christian woman, I know that people can get help to better themselves. Some people can, some people won't, but it's good to offer it. We can't just lock somebody up and then let them out and not provide support when we let them out.
Right. And so I will say, if folks are interested in reading more, the full report is available online, and I can link that to Dr. Daisy so you can post it. But it's through the Global Rights for Women, which is the organization that coordinated the report. And the DV workshop is currently coordinated by Domestic Abuse Project and working towards implementing attainable solutions that are outlined in the report to help better support victims of domestic violence.
Well, that is so amazing. And my last question before we end our session today, because this was really educating, and I really like the fact that you bring all this. And is the information in Spanish and other languages?
I am not sure. That's a great question, but I will definitely look into that and send that.
That would be really nice. So whoever's watching us, even if this is not your language, English, that just so they know that organization is available to anyone. I think they may have translators anyway. So that's really good. Last question is, how do you heal? How can healing and empowerment be prioritized in the aftermath of, domestic violence, gender-based violence? What role can our community play in this process when that person is healing, when that person has went through all this? How can us as a community, when somebody's trying to get back into their life, get back, they've been through it all, from your experience that you've had to do that as well, how do you, what do you need? What do you need from us as the community, or what do you see, just your, from your experience, that would be helpful?
Yeah. So first, I think it's important for us to, take this through the lens of hope because healing is possible, right? Survivors of gender-based violence are, they're defined not by what happened to them, but really, we are defined by our resilience, our strength, and really the ability to reclaim our lives. Too often we talk a lot about the harm, but I think shifting the narrative as a community to, one of empowerment and possibility is important, right? Survivors are not broken. They are whole, they are capable, and they deserve, time and resources to heal. You know, um, so I think that's really important. I think that we need a community that, prioritizes financial security for survivors, stable housing for survivors, a criminal justice system that prioritizes their safety and accountability for harm. And I think when it comes to like day to day, I I just think that the little small acts make an enormous difference, like being a good neighbor or checking in on your friends or loved ones when something feels off. Like I shared that had happened to me. Like when your friend is in crisis and, if you're able to, I implore folks to not abandon their loved ones because they need you. Like
Yeah.
it's incredibly painful to watch someone that you love experience abuse. And it's easy to feel helpless and like, what can I do? But you don't have to have the answers to be their lifeline, but you
Yeah.
can be a lifeline. Just being there,
Just calling them, being there, letting them know that it's okay,
yes.
that they're there, that's one of the things that I find that really is helpful. And that I like that you stated that because, you know, even friends that I've had that have been through a lot, in their careers, um, it's even career based violence, right? Because
Yes.
it happens even in your career. Like if you're in a specific role, um, and that has happened to you. So it's really important to support. Like me, I'm the type of person that if my friends don't text me more than 2 days, I'm like, hey, what happened to you? You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
what you doing? Oh, I was just busy. I say, hey, if you text me, even if it's a day or so later, I know you're alive. You know what I mean? It's like that kind of thing. And if it's people that you work with a lot and you engage with a lot, then you want to make sure that you are fully engaged with that person. Like you mentioned, the change in you that should have sparked something in someone, right? I
Mhm.
think also something that I didn't ask about, because we just talked about in general, we were talking about women, but this also happens with children,
Mhm.
right?
It does. It happens with children and it happens with men,
Yes.
and we don't talk about that.
Yes.
We need to. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but
Yeah.
like I do want to highlight the importance
Yes.
of like
Yes,
this
please.
issue against men. I don't know if you know this, but 1 in 33 men will experience rape in their lives,
Hmm.
71% before the age of 25. Like that's terrible, and it's important that the community understands that your gender doesn't disqualify you from experiencing violence. And I think
Exactly.
by having these open conversations, men would feel more comfortable sharing that stuff, and we know that that number is underreported because we stigmatize women, but we super stigmatize men,
Hmm.
and so yeah.
And I think those reports would reflect more if not only, like you were stating, that you bring it into the schools and educate the schools and educate children on understanding, what is the right wrong way to do things, right? But I think by teaching our children from a young age, when they become adults, women or men, that they can know where they need to go if they experience this, right? So I find many times we're always, like you said, we always looking at the women's side and not the men, but sometimes men are more afraid than women to speak up because they don't feel like they should, because people are only looking at the women, you
Yes,
know
absolutely. And it's just, we talk about like educating our young people, especially our young men and boys. Like, I think it's important for them to know what it looks like and feels like to be in a healthy relationship.
exactly.
And like, what does it look like to disrupt, conversations around, say, locker room talk, right? What does
Exactly.
it look like to, if you're activated, what does it look like to not respond, say with like cruelty or violence? Like we
Mhm.
need to be teaching these skills because in my opinion, boys aren't doomed to be the perpetrator of violence, right? And I think like having these conversations with them at a young age, what these relationships can look like and should look like is really important. And I did want to mention one organization that's doing this work. My partner actually taught a course with elementary schoolers on this through an amazing organization in Duluth called Men as Peacekeepers. And so there's men out there who are also doing this work.
That's amazing. That is
Yes.
amazing because we need this, because what happens is that our children, boys and girls, they are part of an abusive relationship or seeing this, whether it's verbal or physical, because people don't realize, they think, oh, it's sexual abuse, whatever. It could be verbal or physical. It's not necessarily just one, right? It could be psychological, verbal, physical. It doesn't matter. If you are experience anything like this, there is resources, there is things out there to help support everyone that is out there. And if you want to know more about this, Cristina, we're going to say thank you so much. If they want to know more about this, Christina's going to share some of these links with me, and we're going to share them on our YouTube channel, or you can reach out to info@valentin.com, like and subscribe so you can get notified for all the different guest speakers that we have. But I think this was a great topic. We want to say thank you to Cristina for coming here and sharing this wonderful information. We know that many people need this information, haven't seen it and heard it, but we are so grateful that you took some time to spend time with us to share what you are doing in the community. And like you, if you're a person that's in the community, serving in the community, helping anyone out in the community, we want you to reach out to us if you would like to be a guest speaker on our show, because we want to be able to share our love and our resources with everyone in the community. Thank you so much. This is Dr. Daisy Valentin. Like and subscribe to get more notifications. Bye-bye.
Bye.